get this recorded as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at goal setting. We're also going to look at, obviously, the performance conversation itself. We're going to look at also how to review performance as well, different alternative ways to review performance, and then where you can find out more, so giving you more tools and resources to take this forward and to implement it in your own organization. If you do want to contribute, by the way, you are all on mute, and we do that to avoid any kind of interruptions by way of noise and so on. It gets pretty noisy, especially with a large number of people on the webinar. But if you do want to contribute, then what you can do is you can just use the question box on the right-hand side. You'll see it, the dialog box, and I'll stop and ask questions from time to time. So one of the things we're going to be looking at is obviously why change is needed, and that's the first key area that we're going to be talking about. And of course, if you think about performance appraisals and the last few decades of performance appraisals, it's probably the worst kept secret that in corporate life for many decades, it's been an annual ritual of evaluating and rating employees' performance that's been broken, but also very demotivating for a lot of staff. And has resulted in, rather than improvements in performance, has resulted in deterioration in performance. And it's hardly surprising then that many companies are now abandoning the traditional performance appraisal approach. There's estimates in the region of, we don't quite know what the figure is, but there's estimates in the region of around a third of companies are actively redesigning their process, putting in place new processes and testing those new processes. And we're hearing that from clients, all around the country, and in fact also elsewhere in the world as well. So probably, as I say, the first question to ask is, why do we need a change, and what's the reason for the change? So I'm sure you've all come across VUCA. It's becoming a little bit of a cliche now, but VUCA stands for, our world is becoming increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we're seeing a lot of change, and it's very fast-paced change. It's very disruptive change often, that's impacting virtually every sector that you can think of, from kind of the NHS through to tech sector, through to pharmaceuticals, through education, whatever sector, as I say, it's having a big impact. What we're seeing is there's four big challenges that are facing every organization. And those four challenges are, first of all, around productivity. What organizations are looking to do is, obviously, they're looking to get more with less. And a lot of that is about how can we make people work in smarter ways? How can we get more from the talent that we employ, a higher return on investment, if you like. And that's not just about, obviously, introducing robots, which a lot of manufacturers, in particular FMCG companies, are doing, and artificial intelligence, but it's also about how we can make people work in, as I say, smarter ways and more engaged ways, where they're releasing what we call some of their discretionary effort, so the effort over and above the minimum effort required to do the job in an effective way. The second big challenge that we're seeing is obviously around engagement and retention of top talent. Money is simply not seen as a sustainable motivator anymore. If you look at Dan Pink's work on motivation, that I'd encourage you all to have a look at if you haven't already, and there is a great YouTube video on it. Things like autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which are intrinsic motivators, far more powerful than extrinsic motivators. So we need to engage people. We need to inspire them in the workplace. We need to invest in their learning and development and continuous improvement. The third area, which is a big challenge for many organizations, is the challenge around well-being. Because people have been required to do a lot more with less, there's a lot of workplace stresses now. In most workplaces we encounter. Also, people are talking more openly about the stress and pressure, including the distress that they're facing. And things like, work-life balance are coming into the fore. Things like kind of depression and anxiety people are experiencing at work. So all these things, we need to find ways of helping employees to discuss openly with their manager, with others in the organization, how they're feeling at work, and making sure that they're not being burnt out. And then last but not least, innovation. There's a real imperative around innovation in the workplace, not just product innovation, but process innovation, people innovation as well. So how can we help ensure that people work in creative teams, not just in physical teams, but in virtual teams with their colleagues here in the UK, but around the world, to innovate and to outpace the competition and stay ahead of the game. We all know, for example, what happened to research in motion, the BlackBerry manufacturer that experienced a very quick demise as a result of insufficient innovation. And of course, that happened at the same time as the rise of Apple. So therein lies a lesson for all of us that we can't rest on our laurels. We can't assume that, we all have to innovate and get every employee in the organization to share their ideas around innovation. So I'd like to just talk about a few organizations where we're seeing that have made the shift and where we're seeing some really exciting new innovative kind of practices coming out of. So organizations, a lot of them actually are in the tech sector, but not exclusively in the tech sector. We're seeing all sorts of organizations, whether it's public sector or private sector, making the shift. So here are some big organizations that have made a shift: Microsoft, Deloitte, Accenture, and Adobe. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Adobe case study, which is really interesting because they had a very kind of rigid annual cycle of appraisals. And the SVP of People said this when they decided to change that in 2012. She said, as a company, we were continuing to evolve from box software that takes 12 to 18 months to release to cloud-based software, real-time services, and cutting-edge digital marketing. But on the people resources side, a lot of our core processes had stayed the same. We just weren't seeing positive results from the way we had been addressing performance. And I wanted to share that with you because I think it reflects a real challenge in most organizations that the pace of change in terms of products and solutions that the company is delivering into customers is not matched by the pace of change in HR. And Adobe recognized this and they introduced a new check-in process. And the features of that new check-in process were around that every manager or employee can request a check-in every 3 months. So it's a 3-month performance conversation. And before the actual meeting occurs, a group of employees will provide feedback on the employee's performance. In relation to that check-in, the nature of the conversation, the focus of the conversation, is very much around coaching and development, and is designed as a continuous collaborative process between managers and employees. And we see that with Adobe's new system now, it's focused on both ends of the performance curve. So it's not just focused on high performers, it's focused on keeping high performers, obviously, and helping them raise their game. But it's also focused on offering practical advice for lower performers looking to improve. So there's an example of an organization that has significantly shifted its performance focus based on a key business imperative, which is around making sure that they can obviously develop these very innovative cloud-based solutions. If we look at some of the limitations then of traditional appraisals, there's numerous. It's really become a rite of corporate kabuki. Now, the word kabuki is a great word, isn't it? And kabuki really is a Japanese art form which involves singing, dancing, and art. It's very complex. It's very cumbersome to learn. Hence that word in the context of this particular quote. It really is restrictive of creativity. It generates mountains of paperwork. It's pretty much universally hated, actually, by employees and managers alike. There was some very interesting research by Towers Watson that showed that 45% of managers did not see value in the systems that they used, the performance appraisal systems that they used. And Deloitte did some research and reported that 58% of human resources executives considered reviews an ineffective use of supervisors' time, which suggests that clearly it's not creating value, it's not helping move employees forward, strengthening their performance. Clearly, the current traditional approach to appraisal is broken. Let's just explore that in a little bit more detail and look at some of the shifting assumptions behind that. So if we look at some of the old assumptions, first of all, around the focus of the performance management system. In the past, it was very much focused on past behavior. It was a retrospective look, a look in the rearview mirror, if you want. Whereas in future, the way that many organizations are moving now is towards the future focus, a prospective focus. So it's really around how can we help you develop, how can we help you improve, how can we help you find future stretch opportunities. In terms of goal setting, the old system was very much, and I remember when I went through my first appraisal in my early 20s, was very much an annual top-down process. So the thinking was that you came up with your corporate vision and your strategy, your strategic goals, and then you would cascade it right down through the organization. At the beginning of the year, the manager would sit down with you and talk to you about your top 3 goals or 6 goals, whatever the case may be, and how that would obviously help the overall organization to drive its agenda forward. So it was very much a top-down process. The new focus is very much on a much more agile process because goals and organizational priorities change so much, and it's becoming a lot more employee-driven. And there's a lot of good psychology behind that in the sense that we know that if you impose goals top-down, then you don't have that intrinsic motivational factor, so employees are less likely to engage with the goals and they're less likely to work hard to achieve them. Whereas if you can get the employee in the conversation and you can get the employee to input into the goal setting, it's obviously a much more employee-centered process and a much more empowering process. And those goals then become intrinsically motivating for the employee. So that's a bit of the psychology behind it. In terms of the behaviors, in the past, very much standardized competencies, and you had a set of 10 or 20 competencies or whatever, and every employee would be measured against those competencies. The new approach is very much around focusing on individual strengths, on team strengths, and helping people, recognizing that people aren't good at everything and they're not energized by everything, and helping them to play at their best in the areas where they are most energized. And a good example of this is Deloitte, and we do work with Deloitte, where they very much focused around strengths and bringing those strengths into performance conversations in a very intentional way throughout the organization. And the reason why they've decided to go down that path is because they did a lot of research over the course of the past decade, and what they found that focusing on employee strengths is one of the best ways to actually take their performance to the next level and to motivate people. So it's very motivational, focusing on people's strengths and helping them improve in those areas where they can give their best contribution. In terms of the link to rewards, the old style appraisals had this direct link between ratings and rewards. And what we're seeing is a very courageous now shift, which is great in my view, breaking that link, to the old bell curve where, people were rated in the top of the bell curve, they got the most, and people who were rated at the bottom got the least. There's that forced distribution approach. And what's interesting actually is the company that first launched that whole bell curve approach, GE, General Electric, the General Electric kind of multinational organization, they've themselves ditched that approach and they've moved away from it to break that direct link to rewards, which suggests that actually, things are shifting very fast in terms of how we measure contribution and how we reward contribution. And finally, the focus in terms of development has moved from fixing weaknesses, focus on what's wrong, where aren't you performing particularly well, to very much sort of coaching-led conversations to help optimize strengths, but also to tackle risk areas. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. I'll stop shortly for questions, but I just want to first of all introduce you to our definition in terms of the purpose of performance management, and then we'll get into some of the specific kind of techniques that you can use. So we see performance management as a process to inspire excellence by positively stretching people to optimize their strengths, reduce performance risk, and achieve beyond what they thought was possible. And so if you break that down and you look at the different elements of that, what we're saying here is we're saying that performance conversations and the performance management process should be inspiring. We should obviously help people not just discover their strengths, but optimize their strengths, things they're naturally energized by and can be great at, not just good at. And also, of course, it needs to help people to tackle what we call performance risks and blockers. So not just their limiting weaknesses, but also things like overdone strengths, which are often a more important source of derailment than the obvious weaker areas. And also, clearly, it needs to stretch people. I think all good performance conversations, all good development is stretching. People don't grow a lot when they're not stretched, so it's stretching people, but stretching them in the right way outside of their comfort zone, stretching them in a way which obviously capitalizes on their strengths and helps them to build on their strengths, as opposed to stretching them in a way where they don't feel supported and it's areas that simply don't energize them. Are there any questions at this stage before we move on? Okay, I'm not seeing anything at this stage. So what I'll do is I'll keep going, and we'll stop again to ask questions later. So feel free to ask questions. As I said, there will be an opportunity later. So if you look at the research, all the research points to the fact that if you focus performance conversations around strengths, you get a much higher level of motivation, a much higher level of performance. And there was a really strong piece of research that was done by the Corporate Leadership Council a while ago. And what they found, the Corporate Leadership Council, and by the way, this data comes from over 90,000 employees in 135 organizations. And what they found was that if you emphasize performance strengths in performance conversations, you get almost a 40% increase in performance post that performance conversation. If the focus is principally around performance weaknesses, then you get a deterioration of around 30%. This is probably some of the most compelling research that there is out there at the moment in terms of how much strengths can really kind of boost performance and boost motivation as well. As I say, very, very compelling research, and we'd be happy to share that with you if you want more information around that. Let's just talk a little bit about goal setting, because goal setting is obviously the first key part of the performance management cycle. So if you look at goal setting in the past, as I say, it was very much top down. It was very much kind of one way. The manager would tell the employee, what they needed to do. That's giving way now to more regular goal setting, more agile goal setting. So there's very much now an alignment of goal setting with the purpose and overall goals of the company, but also much more regular conversations about goals, and are those goals still relevant? Because things are changing so quickly, the environment's changing so quickly, the priorities, the market's changing very quickly. We would recommend something we call a 3x3 approach, which essentially is limiting goals to 3 to 4 goals per quarter. So really helping people to focus. We know that clear goals, focused goals, if you look at all the psychological research, are really important to direct energy and attention and to motivate people and keep people focused. Goals should be very stretching. As we said previously, they should inspire positive stretch. Also, we would strongly recommend that goals are what we call SMART. So you've probably heard the the mnemonic SMART before, which is specific, measurable, agreed, realistic, and time-bound. We've added an S, and we think that S is really important because that S stands for strength. So it's really asking the question, how can the employee bring their strengths into the way that they're delivering their goals, or in fact bring in their colleagues' strengths to the way that they deliver their goals. We would recommend that you check out something that Google and many other organizations, very progressive organizations, use, called the OKR approach. And I'll just give you an example of OKRs. So the O stands for objective, and the KR stands for key result areas. So an example of an OKR might be the O, the objective might be to improve internal employee engagement, and the key results might be things like reaching quarterly engagement score of 4.5 out of 5 or whatever by the year end, interviewing 30 employees on their ideas for improving the culture, or running 4 lunch and learn sessions on personal development topics during the year. So that's just an example of how you can ensure that objectives are measurable and they're focused and they're clear for employees. And then what's really important is not just to talk about the objectives and the key result areas, the metrics which you're going to use, but also the strengths and the skills in order to succeed. And finally, of course, any blockers and risks that might, be there for the employee, getting them to think about those blockers and risks, coaching them about how they can deal with those blockers and risks. That's really important as well for the manager to be doing regularly with their employee. Let's talk a little bit about then engaging conversations and what an engaging conversation looks like and also doesn't look like. So there's really a decision point in terms of how managers are going to deal with conversations with their people. And there's, as I say, these three different approaches, and 2 we would strongly recommend managers are using, and 1 that they don't use at all. So let's look at the 2 that they should use. The one to use with 80% of your employees, or even 90% of your employees, I would suggest, is the one which is more prospective, it's more strengths focused. So it's really focusing on successes and strengths that people are bringing to the role, and it's helping them move from good to great. There are going to be a minority of employees, though, where they're underperforming. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But in those cases, it's important to focus on the improvement areas and not to fall into the trap of using the third approach, which is often used actually, and the conventional wisdom in organizations from HR has been to use this approach, which is the sandwich approach. And all that the sandwich approach does is to demotivate your good people, because all they're going to hear during the conversation is what they're not doing well. And the poor performers are going to walk out of the conversation thinking, oh, my performance wasn't so bad after all. So it's going to let them off the hook. So we would strongly recommend that organizations avoid using the sandwich approach. There's been some research about the pitfalls of that sandwich approach. So we need to debunk the myth that this is the best approach to use. And either we need to choose the top approach there, focusing on strengths and successes, which will be appropriate for the vast majority of your employees, or that second approach, which is around the how the individual can really improve and move from poor to good, and then obviously to great, hopefully, or alternatively to manage them out the organization. And what's really important here is this situational kind of approach where managers have to judge where their employees fall and to adapt the technique and approach depending on where their employees fall. And so if we can imagine employees' performance across these 2 different variables, on the vertical axis their performance, on the horizontal axis their passion or energy for the work, we end up with 5 categories of employees. And what's really important, obviously, is to recognize these categories and to recognize where the manager's employees fall, into these different categories, and then choose the relevant approach, choose the relevant technique. So with vital talent, obviously, it's really important to empower these people, to delegate to them, to coach them, to encourage them, and so on. Whereas with disengaged underperformance, it's important to have very direct, straightforward conversations about what the individual needs to do to improve, and what will happen if they don't improve as well, and to try and analyze the source of the underperformance as early as possible. So these are very, very different types of individuals and types of performance that managers are going to have to learn to deal with as effectively as possible to ultimately get as many people as possible into that vital talent category. This is just hopefully a helpful diagram just to show you that a more prospective conversation and one that's focused on strengths and successes is a much more empowering conversation, and it's a conversation that is appropriate for the vast majority of your employees. When I go out and I talk to organizations, they have not got a normally distributed bell curve in the organization. What they've got is actually a curve which is skewed over to the right. What that means is the vast majority of their people are actually performing pretty well. In fact, many people are performing very well. And so in those cases, it's appropriate to adopt a coaching style, and so managers need to be trained in how to coach effectively. And managers also need to also understand people's strengths, what really energizes them, and how they can help people move from good to great in those areas of greatest strengths. We talked a little bit about earlier that managers simply can't focus on always helping people optimize their strengths and building building skill, experience, and knowledge in areas of strength. What they also need to do is they also need to recognize, of course, that people have performance risks and help people uncover those performance risks and minimize those performance risks. And by performance risks, we mean three different groupings, three different types of risk. We talk about strengths in overdrive, or when strengths are used in the wrong way, the wrong time, the wrong amount. And the fact that many people find quite surprising, particularly in HR and talent management and senior leadership, is that strengths in overdrive are the most important source of career failure and performance shortfall, much more so than limiting weaknesses. Limiting weaknesses, of course, also important to deal with and to deal with swiftly, decisively. And limiting weaknesses are weaknesses that limit somebody's performance, as opposed to a weakness that we would refer to as allowable, which doesn't have a significant detrimental effect to somebody's performance. And then last but not least, you've got sources of interference, and many of those are internal to the person. So these are psychological barriers and blockers to effective performance. Through helping people understand their strengths, they can actually far more effectively overcome some of those performance risks. And they do that through being more empowered, more willing to overcome some of those performance risks, but also by finding different strengths-based ways to overcome some of those performance risks. And an example of that might be that if, for instance, you have somebody who's not particularly collaborative, there might be somebody else in their team who's very collaborative that they can partner up with. So through complementary partnering, they can mitigate or reduce that area of performance risk. So we get managers and people to start thinking about how can we work together in complementary ways? How can we use some of our natural strengths to overcome some of our risk areas, including our limiting weaknesses and our overdone strengths? What we've done here is and we will be sending out these slides to you, by the way, after the session. We've identified here a number of powerful questions that you can help to stretch, the most effective performers, but also all the other performers as well. And there's a number of very easy questions to ask here, but incredibly powerful questions. And I want to draw your attention particularly to that second question in the first category, delivering better performance. What have been the most energizing aspects of the job for you? And what have been the most least energizing aspects? If every manager asked this question of their employees, they would understand, get insight into their employee strengths, in far more, at a far more granular level, and they'd be able to help people to develop those strengths and to optimize their strengths in their day-to-day work. The second category of questions relates to more personal development. So you can see that first question there, what on-the-job experiences will stretch you to the next level? So it's really tapping into what's energizing for people, what's going to stretch them, what's going to take their performance to the next level. And those questions are based around the 70-20-10, obviously experience, engage, educate. So 70% of the focus should be on on-the-job experiences, 20% should be engaging other people to help you, like mentors and coaches and buddies and feedback givers and so on, and only 10% should be on training. So the focus very much should be on the job experiences, on the job learning, and that's what we see all the better practice organizations and our clients are doing it really well doing. They're focusing the development around on the job experiences in the main. Just to say a few more words about how focusing on strengths helps to tackle performance problems and risks. We talked a little bit about this, but what we find in our work with lots of different clients now, individuals, teams and so on, is first of all, it reduces defensiveness. So when you start talking to people about performance risks and that everyone's got performance risks, and you know, to be human is to have vulnerability, and it's important that we talk about those in open ways, it reduces defensiveness, and people get into the conversation in a lot more natural ways. But even more importantly, it helps people think about creative solutions to overcome their weaknesses and risks, and more positive solutions as well, rather than putting them in that defensive posture where they're not really receptive to learning, they're not receptive to doing things in different ways and forming new habits. And then it also empowers positive change and success habits. So a strengths-focused approach to tackling some of those limiting weaknesses and performance risks can be an incredibly powerful approach to use. We've seen that across a wide number of client organizations. We do feel, and I started actually my career after a stint in academia in employee relations, and I spent the best part of 5 years in employee relations and became head of employee relations for one of NatWest's biggest subsidiaries. And one of the things that you learn very quickly in employee relations is that you've got to be decisive and honest in dealing with poor performers. So, it's inappropriate to have just a positive strengths-based conversation with a poor performer. Well, what we need to do is we need to help the poor performer understand what their expectations are for the role. So we've got to clarify the standards. We've got to really explore with that individual the causes for the performance shortfall. So are the causes around motivation? Are the causes around ability? Are the causes around personal issues outside of the workplace? We've got to provide very clear feedback about what needs to change, what needs to improve. And we've got to support and coach the individual. Now, often through an exploration of the individual strengths, it becomes apparent that the individual actually has got strengths which are not a good fit for the role. So then it's about helping the individual find another role, either inside the organization or outside the organizations where there might be a better strengths role fit. But of course, if the individual doesn't improve in a reasonable amount of time, and a reasonable amount of time I do not believe is a 6-month period, as I've heard from some HR people out there, a reasonable amount of time is a few months. If they're not improving, then they should be put on a performance improvement plan, managed very closely, and then ultimately managed out if they're still not improving. But obviously HR should be involved as early as possible in that process. And we've actually got a blog that I produced about how to ace tough feedback conversations. But as I say, the key thing is to be adult and honest in having those conversations. These are conversations that many managers fear. And I think the reason many managers fear them is that they haven't got the right training and they haven't got the right tools to have those conversations effectively. In terms of reviewing performance, if we look at the last aspect in terms of reviewing performance, what's really important here, as we've said, is regular check-ins, feedback from colleagues as well, ideally 360 feedback. And there's a lot of very interesting now new tools out there and tech platforms out there that help you to do this, like Impraise, like Workday, these sort of tech-based solutions that I'd strongly recommend, app-based solutions that I strongly recommend you look into. And if you do retain the rating system, which many organizations have decided to ditch, my strong recommendation to you all would be to simplify it, to introduce OKR type ratings, and to flex your approach to the needs of different categories of talent based on the passion performance grid we went through earlier. But I think that it's a good approach to be courageous and to break that direct link with the overall pay award, and base pay awards on market movements in pay, but also merit-based increases based on contributions. Allocate a pot of money to the managers and allow the managers to make the decisions in terms of what pay increases within some guidelines, obviously, that they give to their people, but not be rigid and use the as I say, the forced distribution method to do that, because that always backfires. So hopefully you found that useful. We've covered a fair amount of ground. What I would strongly recommend you do, we're going to send out the slides to you all, and I strongly recommend that you take a look at some of these resources. We've got a whole bunch of blogs, and there's some blog links there for you. There's also a fabulous CIPD now podcast, and in fact, it's not just a podcast, but it's a whole pack on strengths-based performance management. CIPD started looking into this now. I contributed to a podcast, and that's been really well received. I would strongly recommend you check that out, and you look at some of those additional resources. Feel free to contact us. We'd love to help you to obviously implement a strengths-based performance conversation process in your organization. And the final thing I'd like to say before I stop and take questions right at the end is that we are running another webinar, which is next week on the 28th at 2 p.m. And that's going to be on tackling overdrive. So it's really going to be on understanding overdrive. What are the triggers of strengths in overdrive when strengths are used in the wrong way, the wrong time, wrong amount? And how can we actually deal with that overdrive? So I'll be running that next week. I hope you can join us then. And thank you so much for attending. For those of you that need to go, I'm going to take some questions now. Let's just see what questions I've got here. I've got quite a lot of questions. Yeah, hopefully I've answered that question about how do you give pay awards. So you obviously look at market movements and market changes in pay for particular job categories, but also you allocate managers a pot of money, and with some guidelines, they can allocate that money based on contribution of the individuals in the team. Can we go over the OKR concept and Google business case? Given the time, what I would suggest you do is check that out. There's a brilliant video on YouTube around the Google OKR process. It's quite a long video, but it's a very good video, worthwhile looking at. Let's see if there's any other questions. Yes, so somebody's asking if the research, the CLC research, Corporate Leadership Council research that I was referring to earlier, is the 2002 report. It is the 2002 report, yes. There is some additional research, by the way, that CIPD is doing, so reference that as well. Thank you very much, all. You take care, and hopefully we'll speak next Thursday.